Welcome to another episode of Prime and Load. Today's episode is the first in a new series we're experimenting with. Glorious Soldiers is a series highlighting the stories of specific units throughout the 18th century. Our goal is to explore the notable units and regiments that we often talk about but don't really have the time to look into during our regular battle episodes. If this kind of series is something you're interested in, or you have suggestions for future Glorious Soldier episodes, please let us know. Use the number in this episode's description to send us a voicemail or a text message and let us know what you think. To kick off our first episode in this series, we're joined by Gabe Neville, author of The Last Men Standing, the 8th Virginia Regiment in the American Revolution. Together we explore the 8th Virginia's unique cultural makeup, their battle history, and the journey these men took from raw recruits to some of America's first westward pioneers. I'm Lee Gugino, joined always by Drs. Alex Burns and Andrew Bamford. Thank you for joining us for Glorious Soldiers, the 8th Virginia Regiment.
We did an introduction a little while ago to the Continental Army, so we thought we'd revisit that topic and zoom in by way of a case study on one particular Continental Regiment. And very conveniently, there just happens to be a book out on the 8th Virginia, written by Gabe Neville, who joins us as our guest today. Gabe, just to kick things off, do you want to introduce yourself to the listeners and perhaps give us an outline of how it is that you came to be working on this book?
Well, first of all, thank you, gentlemen. I'm delighted to be with you and have a chance to talk for more than 10 minutes about my project. It's a great pleasure. And compliments to all of you for what you're doing here. I've listened to every episode except this latter half of the last episode, and you really are doing fantastic work and filling a niche that needed filling. So kudos to all of you. About me, maybe the most important thing to know is that I'm 58 years old, which means that I was 8 years old during the bicentennial of the American Revolution. And I lived in southeastern Pennsylvania, very close to Valley Forge Park, about a half mile from a Continental Army cemetery that contained, I think it was 22 unidentified Continental soldiers who had died in the church across the street from it, either during the Valley Forge encampment or after the Battle of Brandywine. That really captured my imagination. But the thing that really grabbed me was my sister had a subscription to National Geographic magazine, and the July 1976 issue had a full photo spread of photographs of Revolutionary War veterans, all very elderly men, all taken in the 1850s, maybe into the 60s. And there were, I think, 8 or 9 of them. I think 12 maybe have been identified now. And I was just mesmerized, like I was sitting in a time machine watching the past. I sat probably for, well, what I remember as hours, it was probably minutes, staring at those pictures. And I still think of them sometimes. So I've had a lifelong interest in the Revolutionary War. The 8th Virginia, I have several reasons for being interested in it. First of all, living now in Virginia, but growing up in Pennsylvania, that qualifies me almost as an 8th Virginia soldier, because that was the story for most of them. Its very famous first colonel, Peter Muhlenberg, was from near where I grew up. And during my years working in the United States Congress, I walked past a statue of him probably every other day. And once I had begun my interest in this, I felt like he was looking over my shoulder, making sure that I was keeping up with my project. And I do have an ancestor who was in one of the 2 Pittsburgh regiments or companies. I still know very little about him, but I know a lot about the regiment he was in now. The project itself began probably in 1998, if memory serves. I happened to be in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and walked into the David Library of the American Revolution, which is now closed. But at the time, it was the place to go for Revolutionary War research in the United States. And asked, told the librarian I wanted to see what I could find on the 8th Virginia Regiment. And he said, well, the card catalog's over there. There's a bunch of file cabinets over there, and the books are over there. So have at it. 2 hours later, they were closing, and I was leaving. And he very politely asked me how I had made out. And I said, well, sadly, there really doesn't seem to be much out there. And he gave me this look that I've never forgotten. Initially, seemingly trying to figure out whether I was actually interested, or if I was going to quickly go home and watch, the latest Seinfeld episode and never remember the conversation. And he decided to challenge me instead. And he said, there's a lot out there. You just have to go find it. About a year later, I started working across the street from America's greatest research library, the Library of Congress. And that was 25 years ago. And now I've got a book.
So in terms of the sources that you used, then, what did you find? Where did you find it? How did that process of piecing it all together work out? Because I mean, it's incredibly profusely referenced. You clearly have found pretty much everything there is to be found by the looks of things.
Yeah, so I was not the first person to be discouraged. In my preface, I quote a couple of 20th century historians who said that we're never going to learn anything more about this regiment. Happily, they were completely wrong. And I had the advantages of transcribed pension applications and Google books that those guys did not have. But I did a lot of art, hands-on paper archival research. I traveled to Philadelphia, New York, Charleston, Richmond, Williamsburg, Louisville, of course, the National Archives down the street from my office. And I relied on things like obvious things like muster rolls and payrolls, orders, correspondence, newspapers, local histories, which are often not used in this kind of research, court records, some financial records, maps. I mentioned archives. There are some small museums that have collections of letters that don't ever seem to get used. Of course, the Southern Campaign's pension transcriptions, which are just phenomenal work. They've transcribed every Southern pension application, and it's searchable and tremendously helpful. The one thing that is most amazing to me is private collections. I got an email one day from a woman who had a letter in German written by a 16-year-old recruit about the second day after the rendezvous, written home to mom and dad. I think it may be the only such letter from an enlisted Continental soldier that survives. I would be happy to be proven wrong, but it's really something. But by the way, that soldier deserted about a week later, but he was recaptured and brought back by the ear. So that's what the research was like.
Hey everyone, Lee here for the Prime and Load team. We're passionate about exploring 18th century history and tactics and bringing those stories to you. But we need your help to grow our ranks. Please share this episode with a fellow history buff, leave a review where you can, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Most of all, join our email list. It gets you updates and insights into what's coming. You can join by using the link in this episode's description below. Thanks for listening, and now let's get back to the episode.
I mean, you've mentioned one peculiarity, if you like, of the regiment in that German presence, which I'm sure we'll come back into when we start talking about the regiment and its story. And there are other factors, the frontier element in terms of where the regiment was raised. I mean, if one were to say, I'm looking for a typical Continental Line regiment, or even a typical Virginia Line regiment, does the 8th serve that purpose? Is it a unique story, or does it? How much does it tell us about the wider experience of the Continental Army?
Mm-hmm. So that's a good question. A little bit challenging to answer. The one could say that all human beings to a space alien are very similar, but once you get to know an individual very well, they start to seem unique, right? So uh, the Eighth Virginia was distinct in a few ways. Its ethnic makeup, its base geography, the fact that it carried rifles initially exclusively. Um, those things are indeed somewhat unique. Uh, but in terms of the way it was organized, its structure, most of its career, uh, those things it has in common with other Virginia um units. Virginia itself was different from Pennsylvania or Massachusetts in the way it organized its initially provincial forces, later continental forces, which maybe we can talk about a little bit. But I think that's a both and, Andrew.
No, it's fair enough. I suppose it begs the question: is there such a thing as a typical Continental Regiment? I was thinking if I threw the question back at myself, is there such a thing as a typical British regiment? And they've probably got things in common, but there's an awful lot, as you say, of individual human characteristics.
Yeah, well, I mean, if it's not premature, I'll just highlight a couple of things that make it unique. The 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 geography of Virginia at this time, well, writ large, it was massive. It went from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Mississippi River and north to the Great Lakes, according to its charter. Most of that was still held by the Indians and off limits to settlers. Uh, the first mountain range that you encounter traveling west from the coast is called the Blue Ridge Mountains. Beyond that, there had been no settlement until about the 1730s. East of that, Virginia was very homogenous. It was very British, very Anglican. The Church of England was the established church, and it was mandatory by law that you attend an Anglican service at least once a month. They earlier on had actually kicked out Quakers and other such folks that they didn't want to have around. In the 1720s and 30s, they decided that it would be useful to bring other Protestant populations. So these would be Palatine Germans from the Rhineland and Ulster Irishmen down into the Shenandoah Valley beyond the Blue Ridge, frankly, to act as a buffer, so that if there were an attack from Indian tribes or even perhaps the French, there would be some people standing between old Virginia and those adversaries. So fast forward a few decades, by the time of the Revolution, the question is, well, we have kind of kept these people at arm's length over there, but now we could use them in the army. Will they enlist? Well, there was no question about the Irish, the Ulster Irish. One had to try to keep them from fighting, particularly by stereotype, but there's lots of history to back that up. The Germans were another question. Some of them were Mennonites and pacifists. Most were not, but they, linguistically they were separate, and so the Eighth Virginia was conceived as a way to get the Germans to enlist. The field officers were all German. The regiment was referred to as the German Regiment it was not a statute because the Virginia Convention didn't presume to have lawmaking powers yet. The ordinance that authorized it. But it was never thought that it would be entirely German. So it was, my estimate is it was about 40% German, about 40% Scotch-Irish, as we say in the United States, and the balance being English and some Dutch and miscellaneous. So they were different that way, sort of culturally, and that history was different. The other thing is, and I hope we'll have some time to talk about rifles, and maybe I'll just put a pin in this. They were all riflemen at the beginning. Rifles were associated with the frontier in the West, And it was assumed that because someone came from Augusta County or Fincastle County, that you would be an expert marksman. It wasn't always true, but I think it had something to do with available firearms as well. The 8th Virginia was entirely rifles at the beginning. So that's definitely a distinctive there.
I mean, let's jump into that now, because that was something that really struck me reading the book, that it's almost a deconstruction of the frontier rifleman who won the American War of Independence myth, deconstructing the story of one regiment, because you read, what is it, about 18 months, 2 years in, and the colonel's having to say, well, I'm going to give my guys muskets because they don't know how to use these Pennsylvania rifles.
Yeah, so that's actually a really interesting data point that adds great complexity, not just to the history of the regiment, but also of the mythology of the Revolution writ large, as you note, Andrew. So backing up in history just a little bit, the rifle came to the United States from Germany, those shorter Jaeger rifles. They were adapted for frontier use, primarily for hunting. They developed longer barrels. They initially were pretty high caliber, 50, 55. And they were used for subsistence living. They were used for hunting, for fighting Indians if you had to, for just general self-defense. One cost about a third of one's annual income, so they were prized possessions, even if they were not the ornate, fancy ones. And true frontiersmen really were expert marksmen. There is a story about a frontiersman named Simon Kenton, who allegedly shot the head off a turkey from 300 yards. And someone recently commented that it's easy to be dismissive of such a story, but one should not assume that he was able to do it again on the second shot. Right? So they really were expert marksmen. There also was a shortage of firearms in Virginia and probably throughout the colonies. Any muskets that were sitting around were 20-year-old weapons from the French and Indian War sitting in a warehouse somewhere. So when Virginia raised its forces initially, and it did it in 3 authorizations. The first authorization was shortly after Lexington and Concord. They authorized 2 regiments. Then there was a second authorization at the very end of 1775, with the troops raised in the spring of 76. The 8th Virginia was part of that, and there was a third authorization later. All initially provincial troops. Each of those regiments in the first 2 authorizations, and I think also the third authorization, but there are 2 or 3 regiments I can't demonstrate this for. They had 10 companies, 2 or 3 of which were rifle companies, always from the frontier, recruited on the frontier. And this was to approximate the British practice of having grenadiers and light infantry. The authorizations explicitly said, to include 2 or in some cases 3 companies of riflemen, quote, to serve as light infantry. So the 8th Virginia uniquely was specifically intended to be a full regiment of rifles, which makes it at that time unique in the entire Continental Army. Rifles, having come from German and being the American long rifle, or the Pennsylvania long rifle, being an artifact of German-American culture, they were made initially in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, York County, Pennsylvania, and then followed this poorly remembered immigration trail, the Great Wagon Road, or the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road, which stretched from Philadelphia west past Lancaster and York, and then curved south through the Shenandoah Valley and continued all the way to Georgia, Augusta, Georgia. I refer to it as the Oregon Trail of the colonial era. Um, so the rifle followed that path. It was not a common device in New England, for example, but in Western Pennsylvania and Western Virginia, they were quite common. As I said earlier, there was an assumption that if you were from Western Virginia, you were an expert rifleman. Um, there are records for one company, and the vast majority of the men had to be issued rifles, which discredits the notion that these guys were all expert riflemen right off the bat, right? But some of them genuinely were expert riflemen. So you're right. After a year, Colonel Muhlenberg, very shortly before his own promotion to brigadier general, wrote to George Washington and said, "It doesn't really work to have these rifles in the hands of soldiers that are sleeping in the open. I'm not an expert on weaponry, but I've been told that rifles, by their nature, are just more difficult to maintain than muskets anyway. Harder to clean. They would foul. They would rust." And I think Muhlenberg just wanted easier weapons for the men to maintain. Washington's response is interesting, though. This was through an aide de camp. He said, "I hear you. I understand. And yes, we will issue muskets to all of your soldiers who are not experts with the rifle. We don't know what the proportions are. We can guess by geography. But it's pretty clear from that not all of those soldiers gave up their rifles to receive Charleville muskets in the spring of '77. That's a cliffhanger we can pick up from later on. What happened with the riflemen who remained.
Well, I was going to ask you as the next question, actually, can you give us, and I think I have to ask a brief outline of the service, because the one thing that struck me again was this is a regiment that got just about everywhere, or at least some of it got just about everywhere. You look at the index, and I don't think there's a major battle from the first 2/3 of the war that there weren't a few of them at. So, yeah, within the constraints of the podcast, can you give us a brief rundown of where they went, what they did?
I'll actually make it. There are two ways to do this: very briefly or at great length. So I'm going to do the former. They were raised in the spring, the winter and spring of 1776. Some of the companies were carryovers from previous experiments in military organization of Virginia. In other words, converted minute battalions, converted not battalions, minute companies, converted volunteer companies. A little bit hard to trace in most cases, but in some cases it's clear. Their rendezvous was in Suffolk, Virginia, which is a little town near Norfolk, in southeastern Virginia. Major General Charles Lee came to take command. Their first task was helping oust Lord Dunmore, the last royal governor of the last British governor of the colony. They did almost all of that. Just before that process was complete, Henry Clinton showed up with with some soldiers, and there was Admiral Peter Parker, or Commodore Peter Parker had, I think it was 3,000 redcoats on the way from Ireland. So Lee grabbed the regiment and raced south to Charleston to defend that. This was a source of great controversy because the regiment was not a Continental Regiment. It was a provincial regiment. Going to South Carolina was not their job by definition. And so you had a bunch of desertions. They were brought into the Continental line during that summer. So they were at the Battle of Sullivan's Island. Then they were going to invade Florida. They didn't make it the whole way, but they did all catch malaria. A very large proportion of them died from malaria. Others were permanently incapacitated. There was no medicine for malaria other than Peruvian cinchona bark at the time. So all of them had chronic malaria for the rest of their lives. Peter Muhlenberg, his family said he died from it in 1806, I think, is the year he died. Then they came north. They tried to refill their ranks. It was a challenge because the Rege militaire had ended. People saw that, oh, wow, people die in war. I don't want to do that. And then battles like Cooch's Bridge, Brandywine, Germantown, they go to Valley Forge. At the end of the Valley Forge encampment, their original 2-year enlistments end. So if they have not re-enlisted or if they were not later enlistments, they go home. That shrinks the regiment even further, and it is provisionally merged with 2 other regiments. So it is known for a while as the 4th, 8th, 12th Regiment. They fight as such at Monmouth. After that, they don't do a whole lot. There's not much going on in the north. Some of them participate in Stony Point and some other skirmishes up in the north. Then they go south for Charleston, the siege of Charleston, and whoever's left is captured there. A few of them avoid capture there, and they continue to serve to the end of the war. But that is a high-level overview of this regiment's career.
I mean, to zoom in a little bit more, any particular incidents or personalities that you might want to elaborate on? I mean, you've got a book to plug here. Tell us a couple of good stories from the history that might entice our listeners to buy a copy.
Yeah, so there are a lot of good stories, and some of them are just very small, sort of character bits. I mean, for instance, Winchester, Virginia, and Frederick County, which surrounds it, they raised a company. The captain was Thomas Berry. His lieutenant was John Jolliffe. John Jolliffe died of smallpox a year in. But when they were out recruiting, these guys are young. They're 22 years old or so, and they each have their quota. Each company officer has a quota for the number of recruits they have to raise, and they're riding their horses all around the county, talking people into joining. And they go up into the mountains, and they, as one did in those days, they stopped at a cabin and asked the woman who lived there to feed them a meal, and asked if they could rest there for a little bit. And she said, "Sure, come on in. I'll show you my puppies. I have puppies." So she opens up the trap door down to the crawl space below the floor in her cabin, and she hands up one dog, and the young officers say, "Oh, it's a cute dog. What's its name?" And she says, "Captain." And then she hands up another puppy, and they say, "Well, what's this one's name?" And she says, "Captain." And then she hands up a third one, and they say, "Let me guess, its name is Captain." And she says, "That's right." And they ask her, "Well, madam, why are all of your puppies named Captain?" And she said, "Oh, any puppy dog can be a captain these days." So that's kept in a family history. Another almost more touching story is this guy William Darke, who is a man's man, right? So he grew up on the frontier. He was the first accounts of him are as an Indian fighter. He's described as a brusque or a stout man of brusque address. He would fight with the enemy, and he would fight with his comrades. He allegedly was at Braddock's defeat. I don't know that that's the case, but it is the case that he was in some sort of service at that time, because he said so himself. He was one of the first in his region to start enlisting soldiers for the Virginia forces. He was a childhood friend of Daniel Morgan. They used to get in bar fights together. So that, this is a tough guy. So he's captured at the Battle of Germantown and carted off to Philadelphia. And then when the British evacuate Philadelphia, he's taken to Long Island. So he's a captive for 3 years. And this is tough time. People are getting what they called consumption or tuberculosis back then. They had to fend for themselves, which meant writing home and begging for money. It's a tough time. So he finally gets exchanged. late in 1780, and he has to walk all the way home. And again, as one did in those days, he stopped at a cabin and asked for a meal and a place to rest. And he sees that the owner has a bird in a cage by the front door. And Dark has maybe $2 or $3, and he offers one of his dollars to buy the bird. And the owner agrees. He buys the bird, and then he takes the cage outside and opens the door to let the bird fly off. Kind of a neat story, right? So now there are harder stories, which I can get into. One, here's a political story I'll tell. So Adam Stephen, Major General Adam Stephen, who, as many will remember, was cashiered after the Battle of Germantown. He plays a central role in what went wrong at Germantown that is not always perfectly well understood. That battle, as you probably know, was as it was being conducted, they thought they were winning. The Continentals were sure that they were winning. And then suddenly something went wrong. And you have, for instance, Jonathan Clark, who was a captain in the 8th Virginia. He says, they drove the British for a considerable time, but something unfortunate happened and we were obliged to retreat. He doesn't know why they retreated. He just knows that they did. And this is common. A Pennsylvania officer said, everything appeared in our favor when the unfortunate retreat took place, which cannot be accounted for. Adam Stevens said that they fled from victory. So this has been a mystery for a long time. There have been all sorts of explanations like dated intelligence or fog, smoke, exhaustion, drunk officers. All of these explanations may be partially true. The one that gets the most attention is the inordinate focus on the Chew House, which Henry Knox insisted they needed to take out. That was on the right side of the line, and that initially only held up the reserve. So that's clearly not the whole story. There was a serious problem on the left, and it can be summarized as petty bickering with Adam Stephen in the center of it. And this reflects on the 8th Virginia and its origins as well. At this point in the war, Washington had begun organizing his forces into a right wing, a left wing, and a reserve or a second line. And he had asked Congress to appoint lieutenant generals to command those three divisions, but Congress wouldn't do it. So he had this practice of elevating a major general for each of them going into any conflict. And this is about the time that he started this practice. So at Germantown, on the left, Nathaniel Greene is pulled from his division to command the left wing, which starts a cascade of ad hoc commanders, right? So Nathaniel Greene is elevated out of his division. Brigadier General at that time, Peter Muhlenberg, is pulled from his brigade to command Greene's division. Colonel William Russell from the 13th Virginia Regiment is elevated to command Muhlenberg's brigade. And Major Richard Campbell is elevated to fill in for Russell. So all of these guys are in a position that they're not accustomed to. More to the point, Peter Muhlenberg had never commanded a division before. And Adam Stephen, who had commanded his first division about 6 months prior, decided that he knew all about it and was going to start giving commands to Muhlenberg's men as well as his own, because Muhlenberg clearly didn't know what he was doing. Mike Harris, by the way, who wrote has a new book out that has written really the best treatment of Germantown specifically. He, to my knowledge, he's the first one to point out that Stephen was giving orders to men not under his command. So I need to recognize that here. What I discovered, though, in other research is that none less than the Marquis de Lafayette tells us that the problem was much larger than Stephen giving a few discrete, inappropriate orders. He says that Greene's entire column was, quote, retarded by an absurd precedence dispute between divisions. That can only refer to Stephen and Muhlenberg bickering, or perhaps more likely Stephen just being a jerk, because he was a jerk. So the 8th Virginia Regiment, by the way, that day was commanded by its new Lieutenant Colonel, John Markham, who, despite his rank and quick promotion, appears to have never actually been in combat before that day. So as they approach Germantown, they take out a picket sooner than they anticipate. Stephen decides that they need to capture the picket as it flees. So he orders the 9th Virginia Regiment under George Matthews to chase them. Well, the 9th is not under his command. It's under Muhlenberg's command. But they go. And then he decides, well, that's not enough men. So he orders the 8th Virginia to follow the 9th Virginia. And the courageous Lieutenant Colonel John Markham refuses the order. Major William Darke, who I referenced earlier, he says, well, then I'll go. So he takes some proportion of the regiment, a third of it maybe, and follows George Matthews. Matthews and Darke fully anticipate that Greene's entire wing is following them promptly, but they don't. There's smoke, there's fog, there's fences. The divisions, the brigades, even the regiments start to drift apart as they try to get around obstacles. So consequently, the 8th and 9th, well, Darke's portion of the 8th and the 9th get captured in toto. The remnants of the two divisions end up bracketing Anthony Wayne's left. Nobody can see who's in front or behind them, and you have a pretty bad friendly fire incident. And at that point, the battle's over, and they all run, but they don't really understand why. So then a couple weeks later, they have a court martial to figure out whose fault things are, right? Stephen gets canned. John Markham gets canned, cashiered both of them. Interestingly, Stephen, it turns out, has a very long history of animus with the officers of the 8th Virginia Regiment that predate the Revolutionary War. Colonel Abraham Bowman was the grandson of a guy named Yost Haidt, who was a Pennsylvania German who brought the first big population of Germans into the Shenandoah Valley. Jacob Haidt, who was Bowman's uncle, had fallen on hard times, and Stephen, as the sheriff of Berkeley County, had seized his livestock and his slaves. A man who became a sergeant in the 8th Virginia went with an axe and cut open the door of the stable and the jail to let out the slaves and the cattle. When Stephen was elected to the 3rd Virginia Convention, Jacob Haidt and William Darke and several other prominent county residents sent I guess you'd have to call it a petition to the Virginia Convention saying that Stephen had stolen his election. And so he was expelled. So you had long-running disputes. And when they needed a scapegoat, it was not hard to find one. Washington, by the way, didn't like Stephen either.
So looking down into the ranks, then something else in the way you see changes in the officer corps. Again, there's strong recruiting. There's strong. They fill the bulk of the companies pretty quickly. As you've said, I think already that doesn't last. It seems, reading the later chapters of the book, that keeping the Virginia line in the field at all, never mind specific regiments, becomes quite the challenge. Did you want to elaborate on how the rank and file were kept up to strength, well, or not, as the war progressed? Because it seems like it got pretty dicey towards the end.
Yeah, well, this is an old story. When the war began, everybody was excited. the very first Continental units from Virginia were actually two rifle companies raised in the same geography as the 8th Virginia from Berkeley County and Frederick County. One led by Hugh Stevenson, who was the brother of a captain in the 8th Virginia, the other by the more famous Daniel Morgan, both captains. And they had to turn many men away. Everybody wanted in on the party, and it was a party. There are accounts of the party. So those are the first ones, and they of course took the very best. They had shooting competitions, I understand, to determine who would actually get picked. Then you had the first and second regiments raised, and they had their light infantry companies who were riflemen from the frontier. So that pulled a few more of the best recruits out. Then you had the 8th Virginia recruit, and it filled up. Every company but one met its quota. And then you had the 12th Virginia in the next authorization that recruited from the same area. And then you had the additional Continental regiments that Congress authorized Washington to raise, and they tried to recruit out of the same territory. Well, you've pretty much bled the region dry now of willing and able men of fighting age. And on top of that, you've got people coming home missing arms and legs, desperately sick with malaria, maybe dead from smallpox, or not coming home at all. It's a little bit difficult to get that guy's kid brother to go sign up, right? Although some kid brothers did. So they tried to recruit and refill the entire regiment after the first year in the South, and they were only able to top off, and that's the term they used, top off the three companies. The others were understrength and stayed understrength. Fast forwarding a little bit, and this is somewhat less particular to the 8th Virginia, but they ended up having to draft soldiers, which Americans don't think there was a draft in the Revolutionary War, but there sure was. And there are a number of men on one-year enlistments starting in 1778 who were draftees. And further on, even that stopped working. The county militia organizations were in charge of the draft as well as the local militia. The militia were called into the field sometimes, which made it hard for them to recruit at the same moment. One statute said if your militia's in the field, you don't have to recruit for the Continental Service. So it became a mess. And by the time of Yorktown, the Virginia Assembly writes to the great hero of cowpens, Daniel Morgan, who lives in Winchester, right in the center of the 8th Virginia's geography, and says, we need you with your charisma and reputation to raise 3 battalions and come to our rescue because Cornwallis is coming. Morgan, unfortunately, wastes a whole bunch of time trying to raise horsemen. That's not what they needed. They just needed men holding guns. Cavalry requires finding saddles and horseshoes and a whole bunch of things they didn't have time for. And he's basically unable to do what he's tasked with. And so he collects a bunch of elders in the area, including my guy, William Darke, but also Horatio Gates and some other notables from the area. And they decide, you know what, Virginia needs a recruiting law with teeth. So they send a letter to the General Assembly saying, I don't think this letter survives. But the statute that resulted from it created real penalties for what we now call draft dodging. If you did not show up for a 2-year militia tour, you were penalized with a 6-month Continental enlistment. And local authorities could be punished for not holding people accountable for enlistment. And deserters were severely punished. If they deserted with a weapon belonging to the Continental Army, the penalty was death. So recruitment got a whole lot better real fast. And you had hordes of militiamen showing up for Yorktown. So that's the story arc on recruiting.
So if I could jump in for a second, Gabe. Do you find I read a bit of the book and saw Curry's name come up again and again as one of your sort of principal like literary sources. Do you find that there are more records from the men who like written sources from the men who enlisted in 76 and 77 and later in the war? Does it kind of taper off sort of as the war goes on?
So I think not. Okay. So you've got two kinds of documents. You've got contemporary documents. So this would be correspondence, orders, diaries, and then you've got retrospective documents. So these are original sources, but they are written sometimes long after. So the first set is mostly limited by literacy, right? So a lot of enlisted guys didn't really know how to read and write. Officers typically did. By the way, I have a sergeant. His name was Henry Wisor, who was recruited by Thomas Barry in Frederick County and promptly made a sergeant because he knew how to read. And he said, "I don't want to be a sergeant. I'm no scholar." And Captain Barry said, "Tough, you're going to be a sergeant." I just think he says this in his pension application. Like, I was no scholar and asked to be relieved. So the retrospective accounts, to the extent that there's a pattern, I think that they're less determined by literacy because most of them are in pursuit of pension benefits. So the way that worked is they would go into a county court and basically do an affidavit, transcribed by the county clerk, and then they'd sign it. So you didn't have to be literate to leave one of those. So what really determines those are written by men who were still alive after about 1820. So old people who enlisted in their 40s, there were not a whole bunch of them, but they were mostly not alive, by the 1820s, 1830s. So yeah, that's the answer on that. Curry himself, his account is in a local county history book that was published in the 1870s or something. And, it's the account, it's relayed to the author by Curry's children or son, one of his children. And you'll see, I sometimes will say, according to Curry, or I think I even say in one place, or so he said, because there are a couple of slightly questionable claims in there. But it's a lengthy, great source that deserves some attention, even if it requires a little bit of skepticism here or there.
Yeah, so often when I'm working on American Revolutionary War battles, it'll be sources that are like Massachusetts town histories, and like, we knew this guy from the Revolutionary War and kind of got his thoughts on this, and he describes a particular battle or something like this. Great. The reason I ask is that when I'm doing like Revolutionary War history, and as a scholar of like enlisted soldiers, primarily I'm looking at like letters and diaries. Yeah. And so frequently I find there's way more letters and diaries from enlisted men in 75 and 76 than there are in the rest of the war. And so I often wonder, is that like, as we go on in time, is the Army getting less literate? Like what's happening? What you talk about with the military rage and the sort of transition to drafting, it's a great story, and one that we don't always recall as we think about the Continental Army. So that's really fascinating stuff.
Alex, what you said about literate might actually be part of an explanation, right? So at the start of the war, everybody wanted to be involved. And a couple years later, it was the people who could be dragooned into service. No pun intended, right? So, I mean, there are complaints that only the riffraff are now, enlisting. And I think one can plausibly deduce that soldiers were less literate 2 years into the war.
Yeah, I mean, it goes from almost being like a respectable middle class adventure that we all go on as a society to man, I really need a meal. I gotta join the Continental Army. Or I want to avoid, 2 years in the militia. I guess I'll serve in the Continental Army for 6
Right.
months or something like that.
Right.
Or I really need some money. This guy is offering me a bounty to serve for him. I'm going to take that money.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably spot on.
Gabe, I've got one more question I was going to pose to you to kind of wrap things up, but I'm conscious I've been hogging the questions so much. I don't know, Alex and Lee, do you have anything else you want to jump in on before I do that?
I mean, I don't want us to go too crazy down on the rabbit holes, but I'm you touched on it earlier, Gabe, about the kind of the cultural makeup of the regiment, and I think oftentimes many people think of the American Revolution being fought by, well, there's Lexington, Concord, Minutemen in Massachusetts and in Virginia and in Georgia, and they're all kind of this homogenous group of people who are fighting, and obviously that isn't the case. Can you kind of speak to the how the makeup of the 8th Virginia kind of differs a little bit, either from other regiments in the Army or even in Virginia itself?
Yeah, sure. So I think Americans think that American history started in 1776, and it did not, right? Virginia was, if I remember right, 167 years old in 1776, right? So 1607 to, I see Alex doing math in his head. I can't do math in my head. I need a calculator. So there's a lot of preceding history, and each colony's history is different. Massachusetts is the Puritan colony. It's a theocracy for decades, right? Virginia is a very Anglican colony. It was very loyal to the crown. When Cromwell took over in the mother country, Virginia refused to submit. Right. So they were all very and Pennsylvania, where I grew up, this is a Quaker colony, right? It doesn't even have a militia because they're pacifists, right? Which makes them utterly unprepared for war, by the way, at the beginning. So each colony is very different. The New England colonies have, as a cluster, of a fair amount in common. Georgia, South Carolina are similar to each other, but and people didn't really travel from colony to colony very much. They traveled from colony to Britain and back, or from colony to the Caribbean and back. There really wasn't that much commerce between Virginia and New York, or between New Jersey and Georgia. And they didn't really get along that well. There's, that great story about, when Daniel Morgan and Hugh Stevenson show up in Cambridge with the first Virginia riflemen, fistfights break out between them and the whatever they were. I get the Massachusetts militia. I assume most of the men in that encampment were militia at that point. So the 8th Virginia's role in that is actually kind of interesting, right? So they're a bridge, right? So they're a Virginia regiment, but most of the men are from Pennsylvania. Most of the men are not from Massachusetts with families that go back to 1620, or from Tidewater, Virginia, from families that go back to 1607. These are people who, like Peter Helfenstein, that the major who died of malaria, he came from Germany himself with his wife and his infant son. Most of the others came, their parents came. Maybe they lived in Pennsylvania for 10 years and then moved to the Shenandoah Valley. So they're very different from the rest of Virginia, which led to that, the recruiting scheme that resulted in the regiment being called the German Regiment. Peter Muhlenberg is on his mother's side, a third generation German, Pennsylvanian, and finishes the war as a major general, right? Well, Virginia didn't have anything to do with Germans before the war, really, culturally. Before the war, the sort of French and Indian War era, even Benjamin Franklin is complaining vociferously about Germans who are coming to this country and refusing to speak English, right? They're overwhelming us. And, rhetoric sounds pretty familiar to other eras, including this one, about immigration. And the war resolves a lot of that, right? I mean, right with the very beginning with the First Continental Congress, you've got people from, in that case, 12 different colonies meeting to figure out how to proceed and having to cooperate with each other. And, someone as opinionated and stubborn as John Adams from Massachusetts saying, well, we really need a Virginian to be the general for political reasons. So the 8th Virginia, in a way, sort of ties North with South. They served in the North and South, but also there were divisions East and West too that we don't think about much, right? So the coastal culture was wealthier, had closer ties to Europe. The Western culture, the stereotypes persist, right? There were a bunch of hillbillies, a bunch of rednecks. And there wasn't a whole lot of mutual respect there. But 8th Virginia, bridged that divide too. So I think that's a pretty cool aspect of the regiment's history that is in some ways unique.
So if I could just follow up briefly about the German stuff.
Yeah.
So a common stereotype you see in the Holy Roman Empire in the 18th century is bounty jumping. That is to say, guys deserting back and forth from different armies. And I do notice that when you describe the letter from the soldier to his parents, he deserted 9 days later. Is there any indication that the 40% of the regiment from the Rhine-Pfalz, did they desert more prevalently than the Scots-Irish part of the regiment, or is that stereotype not something that you see in transfer over to America as much as it maybe is common in German Central Europe?
So I don't think we have a good control sample, Alex. Not that there were too few deserters. There were quite a few. I think there were almost 90 men deserted over the career of the course of the regiment's career. Problem is that we have other motives that contaminate the sample, right? So remember, they were originally a provincial regiment taken out of the colony by Charles Lee. Well, that was literally and explicitly not their job. And a bunch of them quit and went home. The young soldier Heinrich Meyer, who wrote home to mom and dad and then deserted, I think it was he who explained that there were a couple of older soldiers who sort of convinced him to do it, like talked him into it. He complained about small rations and it not being their job to go into the Carolinas. And then there was I want to make sure I'm being accurate. I think the company that had the most desertions early was the Fincastle County Regiment, James Knox's regiment. So this is Southwest Virginia. That county at that time included what is now all of the state of Kentucky, the southern half of West Virginia, and the western tail of Virginia. So these were real frontiersmen. And they're what's his name? The Southern Indian agent for the Crown, Stewart. I can't remember his first name. He had been drumming up military support amongst the Cherokee, and they had been hitting Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina with coordinated attacks. and Virginia launched a coordinated response with the other two colonies at the time that these desertions were beginning. And I'm pretty sure that several of Knox's men wanted to get home to defend their communities. So it's a little bit hard to sort that data. There's also an issue with anglicization of names. It's not always clear whether someone was German or not.
That point about looking westward, then, Gabe, and that kind of brings me on to what was going to be my final question, because there's an expansion that way once the war's been won. I mean, how does service in the regiment fit these people for the rest of their lives, really, and for the shaping of the nation once independence has been achieved?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a negative answer and a positive answer. The negative one actually dates back to their childhoods. I make a point in the book of starting when the soldiers are kids, because those experiences form who they become. And those who lived out on the frontier experienced the French and Indian War, which was brutal. I forget who the author was, but one academic treatment described it as a war of intense mutual genocidal hatred. These kids experienced it. So they, to not put too fine a point, or to not candy coat it, they hated Indians, particularly certain tribes, but they did not always distinguish amongst the tribes. So that's the ugly answer. The more, I would say, positive, but this is complex too. The only way for a person to become wealthy in America at this time was to acquire land. There were no banks in America at all. There was no stock market. There was very little hard currency. Almost all specie went back to the old world. So the only durable form of wealth that really existed was land. And a person wanted to acquire enough of it to be self-sufficient, at which point they could be described as a yeoman, or enough of it to, be described as a gentleman, and not have to work oneself physically. So they all aspired to some version of this, and that meant going west because the eastern lands were all taken. This was in great measure a motivator for 8th Virginia soldiers. The Crown had limited Western settlement, not unrelated, placed a moratorium on the erection of new counties, which disenfranchised Western settlements. The Quebec Act literally cut Virginia in two and handed the other half to Canada, or to the province of Quebec. They really wanted to go west and acquire land of their own. And of course, that frequently meant fighting with native tribes. It was against the law to acquire land absent an Indian treaty, but not everyone respected that. In 1779, Virginia started promising bounty land to soldiers as an inducement to enlist. If you enlisted for 3 years, you got a certain amount. If you served the duration of the war, you got even more. So after the war, and even during the war, as enlistments expired, you start seeing very large numbers of veterans moving specifically to Kentucky. Ohio was still off limits. I haven't run numbers, but I would be surprised if fewer than half of the 8th Virginia's veterans didn't settle in Kentucky after the war. And some continued on into Ohio and Indiana, Illinois, even across the Mississippi and Missouri. So that's kind of the end of the story for these guys. They were I call them the first real pioneers as we conceive of them. Christopher Columbus, I guess, was a pioneer in a sense, but the stereotypical American pioneer with the Conestoga wagon and the fringed shirt and the barroom brawls and the dueling and Oregon Trail and all of that sort of stuff really began with these guys, even during the war.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's. I think we've covered a vast amount in just coming up to an hour and a half. I think we'll probably wind things up there. It certainly served our purposes as a deeper dive into a particular Continental Regiment. I hope for your purposes, Gabe, it served as a good advert for the book. I mean, I'm biased. I commissioned it when I was still with Hellion, but I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and I would certainly recommend it to the listeners. So I hope that's been worth your while there, and thank you very much for coming on.
Well, Andrew, Lee, Alex, thanks ever so much for giving me a chance to talk about my obsession. Delighted to be here.
Murmurs in the Camp is a segment of our show where we answer questions and discuss topics that you, our listeners, want to hear about. If you have a question or topic that you want to submit to Murmurs in the Camp, call or text our Murmurs in the Camp voicemail box at 716-299-8426. That's 716-299-8426.
Hi guys, jcsanka57 at Gmail here. Most Prussian cavalry regiments were 5 squadrons strong. My question is, did they fight one squadron at a time or in a large column?
Yeah, so I'll give this a crack, Andrew. And
Mr. Prussia, I assume nothing else.
Yeah. So
again, I have thoughts, but I'll let you.
The answer is kind of again. It depends. I mean, there are a 5 squadron grouping is a pretty common organization that you see, but it's not is set in stone. I mean, again, there are. I imagine almost like how grenadiers are utilized in some 18th century armies. Squadrons of cavalry are kind of grouped together to fight on the day of battle. There are regiments that kind of stay together, and you have all 5 squadrons there, and all 5 squadrons maybe are fighting together as maybe a somewhat larger tactical unit. But do they all fight in one big column? It kind of depends what the squadron commanders decide, right? There are different ways. I mean, you could have sort of squadrons spaced out in intervals, which makes a charge a little bit less likely to kind of founder and go to disorder, but probably also slows down a charge. You could deploy them in a sort of a deep column. You could deploy them kind of all. The French would say like as a wall, sort of going forward, like basically in a line of battle going forward. I mean, there are many different ways to kind of utilize cavalry squadrons. And again, it maybe because of the more ad hoc nature of warfare in the 18th century, as opposed to when you go into Napoleonic Wars, to some extent, it depends what the brigadier general who's in charge of this grouping is deciding to do, as opposed to sort of a set, we have a cavalry regiment is 5 squadrons. We're always going to have them form in a sort of a 5 squadron battalion column or a 5 squadron regiment column or something like this. But yeah, frequently you do see groups of 5 squadrons mixed together. I mean, in battles like the Battle of Leuthen, frequently the important distinction is not individual squadron groupings, but you have like a first line composed of one sort of cavalry, like say all the dragoons are going to go in first, or probably more likely all the cuirassiers are going to go in first, and then you might have dragoons and hussars in a combined sort of line behind that will go up and support. Much of this is larger than it's a whole 20 squadrons going forward together, as opposed to a independent 5 squadron unit sort of maneuvering across the battlefield. Now, I will say, a battle that I think at the end of our last recording session I said was like the thing I wanted to go back and see the most in 18th century history, and this is the Battle of Strela in August of 1760. There is a Prussian cavalry officer there who decides, I'm going to take that 5-10 squadrons under my command and go all the way across the battlefield and launch an independent attack. So there is absolutely still a degree of independent command. that lower-ranking cavalry officers can assume, but frequently cavalry are deployed as wings, and it's the wing commander who's deciding what tactical utilization they are going to adopt on the day of battle.
This might be a dumb question, but a squadron, what numbers of men are we talking about? Or is that another ambiguous?
It varies greatly from nation to nation. I would say,
of course,
depending on where we're talking, between like 90 and 250 guys. So it does absolutely kind of depend. I would say on campaign, most nations you're looking maybe 100, 120 soldiers would not be, cavalry would not be uncommon to see. The Prussians, I think, have fairly large squadrons by the standards of the day. Other nations have smaller squadrons, but they might have more squadrons in a regiment. It kind of depends which nation you're in. But again, in infantry, the bog standard unit of tactical organization infantry is the battalion of roughly 500 men. It would be easy then to think, a squadron of 5 cavalry, or a grouping of 5 cavalry squadrons would also be about 500 men. Maybe that's analogous to an infantry battalion, and it very well might be, but that's not the exact same. From nation to nation, depending on the situation, it might not be. Yeah. I think I'd roughly run through my answer. What would you add to the cavalry there?
Well, no, I mean, all I'd say in addition to that really is, so we think of the Prussians with the big cavalry regiments, and Bayreuth Dragoner with 10 is an extreme case, but French in the Austrian succession typically 4 squadrons. Austrians, I think, up to 6, sometimes even more for the lights. It's not just the Prussians, and I think the squadron is probably the smallest viable tactical unit. You could fight as a troop, I guess, in a very small action, but that wasn't especially typical. But yeah, as Alex has said, it's the minimum. You can fight as a squadron, you can fight as a regiment, you can fight as a brigade, you can fight as a whole wing, and all of that is deployed at the most appropriate moments if the general commanding knows what he's doing. That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed us as much as we did. Don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter with the link in the description. It's the best way to stay up to date with the show, see what's coming up next, and ask us questions. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford. It was produced by Lee Gugino, music by Brianna Tam, Ardi Son, and Adrian Beringer. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.